Hey, this is Brian for Liberty, and I am responding to another terrible Robert Reich video. I just think it's important for us to have economic conversations. I think it's important to counter some of this programming that's taking place in terms of how we should be handling our tax code, what kind of things the government can and cannot accomplish, and just kind of poking holes in these arguments that are presented as incredibly factual things that are pushing people to a very specific place in regards to how they view the wealthy and how they view our tax code. I do these things live. I'm not a very flashy video guy, so we're just going to get right into it.
Commonwealth are now more concentrated at the top than at any time over the last 80 years. And our unjust tax system is a big reason why. The tax code is rigged.
One of the things he doesn't talk about here is whether or not we are overall wealthier as a society than we have been over the past 80 years. The answer to that is we absolutely are. The fact of the matter is you wouldn't want to live in the world that existed 80 years ago. If you're watching this video and you're in your 20s or 30s and you have a great deal of concern about how unequal wealth is distributed, one of the things you have to keep in mind is what was the standard of living of a 20 or 30-year-old back in the 1940s? And would you want to go back there? No, we are all better off and we are all wealthier now than we were then.
Rigged for the rich, enabling a handful of wealthy individuals to exert undue influence over our economy and democracy. Conservatives fret about budget.
One of the interesting things about these people having undue influence over our economy is that they use their wealth to influence our economy. They use their wealth to coerce government officials, your elected officials who are supposed to represent your best interest, to act in their best interest. The reason that happens is because we have a government system that is far too involved in our economy. Money flows to Washington because that's where the power is. If you want to get money out of politics, if you want to reduce the influence that billionaires have over the economy, then you have to reduce the power that government has over the economy. That's the only way to get that done.
Budget deficits. Well then, to pay for what the nation needs, ending poverty, universal health care, infrastructure, reversing climate change, investing in communities, so much more.
I'm going to go back to that real quick here because I want to make sure you get this laundry list of things written down. With his tax proposals that are coming, we are going to end poverty. We're going to have universal health care. He just says infrastructure. He doesn't get very specific on what the investment in infrastructure needs to be to bring things up to par to where a lot of people think it needs to be. And then reversing climate change. These are the things he's going to throw out these tax proposals. He's going to come up with a number and he's going to say, these are the things we're going to do. And it's important to keep in mind all the things on this laundry list and then look at that number and ask yourself if it seems realistic that if we put this extra money in the hands of government, if these things are actually going to happen. So here we go again.
So much more. The super wealthy have to pay their fair share. First, repeal the Trump tax cuts.
Now, one of the interesting things about the idea of repealing the Trump tax cuts is that our federal revenue is significantly higher now than it was in, say, 2019. The federal government is actually taking in vastly more money now than it was 6 years ago. So the idea that the Trump tax cuts are causing some kind of a budget shortfall is not true. And from an economic perspective, we know that if we increase taxes and we increase regulation, that the trade-off to that is we're going to have a slightly or greatly less productive economy. We know that there's going to be less economic activity. That's what happens. The idea is whether or not these taxes and what we gain from paying these taxes and these regulations and the protection that these regulations give us are worth the trade-off of tax. So I'm not saying I obviously don't think, taxation is theft. We should have a free market economy, which we don't. But the argument isn't that you can't make the argument that increasing taxes, we would have the same amount of economic activity. What the argument that we need to repeal these tax cuts is that given the amount of economic activity that we've had, if these tax cuts hadn't gone into place, but we had the same amount of economic activity, we would have brought in more money. The counter argument to that is pretty simple, and most economists would agree that yes, if we didn't reduce taxes, we wouldn't have seen the increase in productivity in the economy that we did. So that's the problem. That's the first issue with this whole idea.
It's no secret Trump's giant tax cut was a giant giveaway to the rich. 65% of its benefits go to the richest fifth, 83% to the richest 1%.
So again, if you're going to enact an economic policy, whether it's a tax cut or a stimulus plan, it has to be big enough to affect the economy. It seems like a really kind of a no-brainer. The problem that we have with our tax code right now is it's not a problem, I guess, if you believe in a progressive tax code, but the wealthy, the upper echelons of earners in this country pay the overwhelming majority of taxes. This is not disputable. You can go right to the Treasury website. You can go right to the IRS. There's a lot of places that you can confirm this on government websites that show you where the money's coming from. The bottom 50% of income earners pay somewhere in the vicinity of 2.4% of all the taxes collected. The top 20%, I want to say it's somewhere in the 70% range of all the taxes are collected, are paid by a very small group of people. If you're going to reduce taxes to allow more money to stay in the private sector, at the end of the day, those tax breaks are going to go to people in the upper income brackets, because otherwise it's not a large enough tax. There's not enough money being pushed back into the private economy to actually have a significant effect. And he knows this.
Over a decade. In 2018, for the first time on record, the 400 richest Americans paid a lower effective tax rate than the bottom half.
See, they use tax rate, which, first of all, these numbers are kind of bogus, because a lot of it's based on they're calling wealth accumulation, i.e. increase in stock value, for example, as income, and not as what it should be called. So you don't pay taxes on the market value increase of your home the same way you don't pay taxes on the market value increase of your stock until you sell. This leads us into the wealth tax, which is a really dangerous thing. But just to bear in mind that when they come up with this, the rich are paying a lower marginal tax rate, it's not really true unless you count assets, not necessarily income.
Repealing the Trump tax cuts benefits to the wealthy and big corporations will raise an estimated $500 billion over a decade.
One of the things you have to pay attention to every one of his tax proposals is that he's talking about over a decade. At the end of every one of the things, he says over a decade. So you're talking about $500 billion over a decade, which is $50 billion a year, which, as we all know, in the scope of the federal budget, $50 billion a year is nothing. It's not a significant amount of money in regards to overall federal spending. It's not even, it's nothing. It means nothing. So he uses these huge numbers. $500 billion sounds like a lot of money. Even $500 billion in the scope of the over $6 trillion that we spend every year is a drop in the bucket. But when $500 billion over a decade that's the quiet part.
Second, raise the tax rate on those at the top. In the 1950s, the highest tax rate on the richest Americans was over 90%.
Okay, so there's a couple of things going on here. First and foremost, we look at the 50s and the 60s and we look at this high tax rate on top earners and we think, why can't we do that now? There's two problems with that. First, people tend to forget that in the 1950s, the United States of America was pretty much the only industrialized nation that was still fully functional. This is coming out of World War II. There was no competition globally in the capital markets. Everything was flowing through the United States of America. There wasn't a Japan or an industrialized China. Europe was in rebuilding mode. Russia was in rebuilding mode. We were the only game in town, so there was no place for capital to flow. When we cut taxes on that top bit of income being earned, it was because we started entering into an era where capital could flow outside of the country. You're seeing it. We're still seeing the effects of that today, where we are competing in a global marketplace, both in labor and production, manufacturing. There's this global economy that we're dealing with now. So if you want to raise tax rates on the top, increase that top marginal rate back to 90%, you're not going to capture that money. That money is going to flow out of the country. And by the way, tax as a percent of GDP, which is the percentage of tax revenue as compared to the productive economy, has been within 4 or 5 points range, no matter what the top marginal tax rate is. And it's not like all of a sudden we're collecting way less of our economy's productive capacity in taxation. We're not. We're actually pretty close. We're within a few points of record highs right now. So the government is still collecting a percentage of GDP very much in line with what it was then. So raising that top tax rate doesn't say that the government's going to capture more money. It just says that we're going to push the tax rate up at the margins at the top end. But again, I can't emphasize enough that capital will find a place to go. Capital flees to the place where it gets the highest rate of return.
Even after tax deductions and credits, they still paid over 40%. But since then, tax rates have dropped dramatically. Today, after Trump's tax cuts, the richest Americans pay less than 26%, including deductions and credits. And this rate applies only to dollars earned in excess of $523,600.
Just a quick, again, I did another Reich video on this, and it always starts out with billionaires and the super wealthy, but then it starts coming down. It creeps its way down into upper middle class, the lower end of the wealth spectrum. $523,000. Hey, that's a lot of money. Don't get me wrong. That's a great income, but that's not a billionaire. That's maybe that's a person who has millions of dollars in assets, but if it's income, that's still a person who's getting up and going to work every day. So this idea that, again, we're going to tax these few billionaires, it's not true. It's just the lead in. It's the hook to get you into the idea that we need to start raising taxes.
$1. Raising the marginal tax rate by just 1% on the richest Americans would bring in an estimated $123 billion over 10 years.
Decade. Right?
Third,
over 10 years.
A wealth tax on the super wealthy.
This is the most dangerous idea. I can't emphasize this enough, how dangerous of an idea a wealth tax is. Think back to how the income tax was established. The income tax was established only first, it was only supposed to be paying for, it was established to pay for the war debts, right? It was passed so that we could pay off the war effort. And it was a tax on the super rich. It was a tax on like marginal income or on income over $1 million or something like that. It was a tiny fraction of the population that were going to be affected by the wealth tax. The wealth tax on the super wealthy, this wealth tax that he's talking about, you can't believe for a minute that this is where it's going to stay. Okay. This is going to be a tax on anything that you make outside of a tax sheltered investment. This is going to be a tax on appreciation of your home's value. This is going to be a tax that's going to come down and affect the middle class. This is a tax that is going to destroy the ability of middle class families, of upper middle class families, to pass wealth on to the next generation. That's what this tax is eventually going to be. It's being sold to you. It's the ultimate in Trojan horses, just like the income tax was, where they're coming for you. But what we'll do is we'll attack a small number of people, create the precedent that it's okay for government to tax accumulated wealth, and then we can push that out further and further and further, and it'll affect more and more Americans.
Wealth is even more unequal than income. The richest 0.1% of Americans have almost as much wealth as the bottom 90% put together. Just during the pandemic, America's billionaires added $1.3 trillion to their collective wealth.
There's a lot of reasons that this happens. Let me start with the $1.3 trillion to their collected wealth. Is most of these people that wealth is coming from their investments. A lot of times that's an investment or stock ownership in companies that they either helped build or were actual founders. Jeff Bezos is the founder of Amazon. He owns a massive amount of Amazon shares. When they talk about the $1.3 trillion, what they're doing is they're measuring that from the pandemic lows up to the post-pandemic high, and that is their growth of wealth. It's not taking into account, it's not taking the previous high and measuring it to the current high. It's taking it from a low point to a new high point, and they're saying that this is where that $1.3 trillion in wealth was accumulated. So just something to keep in mind about how they're coming up with that number.
Elizabeth Warren's proposed wealth tax would charge 2% on wealth over $50 million.
Now, you might think $50 million, hey, that's a really, really rich person. Not a billionaire, by the way.
And 3% on wealth over $1 billion. It would only apply to about 75,000 U.S. households.
And this is a classic argument that liberals will make is, hey, look, it's okay that we're stealing these people's money because it's only a small number of people. But if you think back to like I said, if you think back to the income tax, if you think back to that, this is exactly how the income tax got passed.
Fewer than 1/10% of taxpayers. Under it, for example, Jeff Bezos would owe $5.7 billion out of his $185 billion fortune. That's less than half what he made in one day last year.
See, what he made, that's being sold to you as if it were income. It's just stock market appreciation. And this is a completely unworkable tax, by the way. You cannot tax stock assets, because what will happen is you'll see the largest sell-off in the stock market that you've ever seen. And guess who's invested? That's pensions for the teachers unions. That's fire department. It's public sector pensions are invested in the market. Obviously, 401ks are in the market. In order to pay these taxes, this isn't Scrooge McDuck with the money sitting in a vault in the backyard. This is money that's invested in the market. These assets will have to be sold in a massive way in order to cover these tax bills.
The wealth tax would raise $2.75 trillion over a decade.
Over a decade. So $275 billion. Now we're talking, that's some real money. Over a decade, $275 billion a year, but it's a completely unworkable tax. It's a fantasy that they would ever be able to collect that money.
Enough to pay for universal child care and free public college, with plenty left over.
By the way, that's in addition to the things that he already listed as all the things we'd be able to pay for, reversing climate change, ending poverty, all that stuff. Now we're going to do universal child care and we're going to do free college, in addition to those other things that he already said. So let's just keep that in mind as we go forward.
Fourth, a transactions tax on trades of stock.
I don't know much about this tax.
The richest 1% owns 50% of the stock market. A tiny 0.1% tax on financial transactions, just $1 per $1,000 traded, would raise $777 billion over a decade. That's enough,
again, over a decade, so $77 billion a year,
to provide housing vouchers to all homeless people in America more than 12 times.
And this is another thing he's adding on top of all the other things that he promised that these tax increases could do. Just keep this all in mind.
Over. Fifth, end the stepped-up cost basis loophole. The heirs of the super rich pay zero capital gains.
Essentially, this is an inheritance
taxes
tax
on huge increases in the value of what they inherit because of a loophole called the stepped-up basis.
So I own my home and then I die. And like I said, these taxes are being sold as a tax that's only going to be applied to the wealthy. We should know enough now that we understand that that's not going to be the case. So I bought my house, let's say for X amount of dollars. Let's say I bought my house for $200,000. I own it for the next 30 years. I die. The house is worth $2 million. I leave it to my kids, and the government taxes that, assesses a tax against my kids, essentially, to pay the bill. Now, I paid the mortgage off. My kids are inheriting this free and clear, but now they have to sell the house in order to pay the taxes because they're not wealthy. It's an amazing, it's amazing how they sell this stuff. At the time of death,
the value of assets is stepped up to their current market value. So a stock that was originally valued at, say, $1 when purchased, but that's worth $1,000 when heirs receive it, escapes $999 of capital gains taxes. This loophole enables huge and growing concentrations of wealth to be passed from generation to generation without ever being taxed. Eliminating this loophole would raise $105 billion over a decade.
Over a decade,
Six,
so it's another $10 billion.
Close other loopholes for the super rich. For example, one way the managers of real estate, venture capital, private equity, and hedge funds reduce their taxes is the carried interest loophole, which allows them to treat their income as capital gains rather than ordinary wage income. That means they get taxed at the lower capital gains rate rather than the higher tax rate on incomes.
Again, you push this down into the middle class, which is inevitably what they're going to do. All of these things are just going to make it harder for middle class folks eventually to make. You got to keep your eye on the prize.
Closing this loophole is estimated to raise $14 billion over a decade.
It's nothing. $1.4 billion a year.
Increase IRS funding. Because the IRS has been so underfunded.
Money. I mean, what percentage of Americans are like, you know what? The IRS needs more money. The IRS itself needs more money to come after they keep talking about how there's not a lot of these people, right? So why do we need to grow the IRS? We're only going after a handful of people, in the grand scheme of things, 75,000 tax returns. Can't the IRS handle that? Well, obviously we need to grow the IRS because the money that they're trying to capture is not necessarily in the hands of the super wealthy. They need to be taxing more people. They need to be auditing more people way downstream of the billionaires that this video pretends to be targeting.
Billionaires are far less likely to be audited than they used to be. As a result, the IRS fails to collect a huge amount of taxes from the wealthy. Collecting all unpaid federal income taxes from the richest 1% would generate at least $1.75 trillion over the decade.
It's $175 billion.
Fully fund the IRS. Together, these 7 ways of taxing the rich would generate more than $6 trillion over 10 years.
Okay. So now we're getting to the real gist of this thing, which is how much money per year is this, right? Well, it's $600 billion. I did the math for you. It's $600 billion, right? Over 10 years, $6 trillion is $600 billion a year. A couple of things to keep in mind here. We are running multi-trillion-dollar budget deficits right now. So this $600 billion wouldn't even come close to balancing the current budget. The other thing is we're going to take this $600 billion. We're not going to do it. We're not going to take this money and use it to reduce our annual deficit. We're going to reverse climate change. We're going to end poverty. We're going to invest in, what does it say? It just says invest in communities. I don't even know. Universal health care, infrastructure. Remember, we're also going to give housing vouchers to the homeless. We're going to have universal free college education. This is where that $600 billion is going to go. This is even if you passed all these taxes and you didn't spend another dime of the money, you're putting $600 billion of new taxes on the private sector, which is going to reduce economic activity, and you're never going to collect all this money, especially considering $275 billion of this is a wealth tax that's going to be completely unworkable. So that's he's just flat out making stuff up right now. But even if we did that, and even if we got all $600 billion of it, and even if it didn't lead to a massive crash of the economy, we're still running $1 trillion plus deficits every year, even with this money. This doesn't solve any problems at all. This video is nothing but propaganda to get the people all geared up so that they authorize the government to start collecting more taxes, which eventually is going to trickle down. And guess what? Just like the income tax, which started out as a tax on the ultra wealthy, will end up as taxes on everybody, because there's no other way out of this. When you have a government that's 36 going on $37 trillion in debt, running multi-trillion dollar deficits, I'm sorry, but you can't take the top 1% or 10% of income earners. There's not enough wealth there to solve this fiscal cliff we're heading towards. So they're obviously trying to create a new tax program so that they can figure out how to gather all this money from the private sector and prevent the economy from blowing up, because God forbid we look at the government and actually try and reduce spending. Anyway, my name's Brian. This is Brian for Liberty, another Reich response. And I hope you guys who stuck around here to the end will take the time to subscribe to the channel. And if you do that, and I see my subscriber base growing, maybe I'll be able to start making snappier videos that people will stick around for a little bit longer with better editing and all those wonderful jump cuts and all this other stuff that they're supposed to be doing. But anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.